Welcome to Third Perk Coffee House. We're here with WRCX TV 40. My name is Fred Cox, and I am here to moderate a very important conversation today. Passing the Torch, a critical analysis of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and its influence on leadership today. I'm so excited because I have two guests who are Martin Luther King Jr. scholars, and they're going to help me facilitate this conversation today. To my left, I have Chad White, Dr. Chad White, who is the pastor of Word Church here in Dayton, Ohio. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And to my right, writer, organizer, and activist, Jared Grandy. Thank you so much for being here today.
Appreciate you.
So I want to have a conversation, but it's important to contextualize it. And I want to start with you because I think this conversation is going to be an intergenerational conversation in which we're going to be able to learn about the way in which his legacy has impacted you. And then just a generation later, we'll see how it has impacted Jared. So tell me, what is one of your very first memories of learning about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
I am a fourth generation preacher, and so the Black church has been my total life from my earliest moment. And so I learned about Dr. King while attending church. That was my first time in Black history plays and learning about his speeches. So that was my first introduction to Dr. King.
And tell me a little bit about like what you learned. So you got introduced to church, but like what did you learn about this man?
I learned that Dr. King loved everybody. I learned that he gave his life for everyone, that he was hated by racists, and that he just literally wanted people to love each other and to get along.
I appreciate that. Jared Grandy, I want to ask you the same question just to see what your context was. Do you think about one of your very early moments when you learned about Martin Luther King? Do you remember where you were? What did you learn?
Yeah, the earliest moments, it was definitely in school. A Dayton public school, it's called Lowe's. I was second or third grade. And my very first introduction, like most people's introduction, is the 1963 March on Washington speech, I Have a Dream speech, and particularly the later half of that speech. No one really talked about the first half, and I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Okay.
But the part about everyone loving each other, not worrying about the color of one's skin, just the content of their character, just a very peaceful figure who just wanted everybody to love each other and get along.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate you sharing that, and I can imagine that we all had a very similar understanding or a similar experience with learning about the principles of Martin Luther King. I think about what I learned about him as a child, and I think about who I know him as today. So tell me a little bit, Dr. Chad White, what has Martin Luther King's legacy done for you personally, now that you're an adult?
Okay.
Tell me.
Awesome. For me, it has transformed my life, it's transformed my thinking, my perspective about beloved community, and the possibility of building this idea of the world house, that love as the motivating factor of what King used, agape, this God kind of love, that if we authentically work to build community, it can happen. Now, of course, we have to work through all the issues and all the ins and outs, but that the possibility of overcoming evil through nonviolent resistance and authentic Christian love, we can build the world house.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit more about that beloved community that you just mentioned, because I'm imagining that that's one of the principles or theories that came out of Martin Luther King that stand with you. Please tell me.
Absolutely. The beloved community would be that place where, again, that people can come together and live in authentic community, that going back to that March on Washington speech, that it's not about the color of your skin, but the content of your character, where all people can move together, they can build together, they can rise together in a place where ethics and morality and sincere brotherhood and sisterhood operate and reside.
Absolutely, and I appreciated understanding that about Martin Luther King, because when he introduced the beloved community, he introduced these facets. It was kind of a response of like, well, if you had to create a community, what would that community look like?
Sure.
And it is so, very much so referenced when individuals have to create what that looks like locally. And so it makes me think, Jared, what is one of those like defining moments for Martin Luther King's legacy for you personally? So I know you mentioned the March on Washington earlier, but tell me about a moment that is a very defining moment for Martin Luther King for you personally.
It's closer to the later end of his, towards the death, towards his assassination. When he was in Memphis, he was there to organize and advocate for the sanitary workers. Yeah. And that's where we get the "I am a man" phrase from. For me, it's important to understand that he was deeply involved in economic insecurity. He was deeply involved in economic inequities, right? He wasn't just worried about, yes, he was a great example of to teach us how to love somebody regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of the wrongdoings they might do upon you. He offered a lot of grace, but he was no fool. He understood the economic inequality that people face. He understood the job market and the structural issues that lie within it. And so for me, that he made a speech, it was called The Other America in 1968. And a careful reading of that speech has taught me how to analyze the issues as they exist today, as opposed to it's not enough to love people, right? Love is a verb. How do you love somebody? What analysis do you need to engage in to make sure our policy reflects the love of humanity? Dr. King was a master.
I really appreciate what you just said, because I think you created a timeline, and I don't even know if you were intentional, but you started off talking about the march kind of created, the march and the "I Have a Dream" speech kind of created a more lofty ideal or a theory as it pertains to like what we are looking for. But then as you transition to one of the speeches in his later point in life, The Other America, he begins to talk really specifically about how the nuances of these ideas and how there's some challenges. And we'll definitely make sure to return back to that conversation. Thank you so much for that. And so, Dr. White, tell me, what are the lessons? What is one lesson when you think about Martin Luther King's legacy that you think we really should be processing today? What is one of those lessons in a more specific sense than some of the broader contexts that we have spoken about?
I would say that commitment, steadfastness, stick-to-itiveness. Dr. King had a vision of what he thought America and the world could be, and he stuck to it. Again, when we get to the later part of his life with the more radical King, his last public speech was at Riverside Church in New York, behind Vietnam, and there were those in King's camp. There were those who were his financiers who said, "Doc, don't come out against the Vietnam War. It is suicide." Even Black America turned on King at that time. When King gets assassinated, his approval rating in Black America is below 50%. But he believed in justice, he believed in equity, and he recognized that the war in Vietnam, not only was it unjust because it was killing brown people that had never done anything to Black people, but secondly, it was taking away money and making the war on poverty. He says it wasn't even a good skirmish. And so money that had been allocated to war should have been allocated to alleviating poverty in America. And so I think it's stick-to-itiveness that over and over again throughout his life, when he went to Birmingham, there were those who told him not to do it. When he went to Memphis, his inner camp, they were planning for the Poor People's Campaign. They said, "Doc, don't go. What are you doing?" And he says, "I cannot ignore these people in Memphis." And so he goes to Memphis with the intention of getting back on the road to plan for the Poor People's Campaign. He gets assassinated. But anyway, I would say stick-to-itiveness. That would be what I take away from Dr. King.
I appreciate that. And I think what comes to my mind hearing both of you all respond is that you both bring up this kind of economic pressure that Martin Luther King posed as a strategy, right? And so kind of moving this message or this conversation away from just simply advocating on the basis of race issues, but also able to understand the intersectionality of how economically this world worked in a way to oppress and or suppress marginalized populations. So your reference is to Vietnam and individuals there, and then your reference are to the sanitary workers in Memphis. So let's talk just a little bit more about that strategy to articulate economically how it supports suppression or oppression. And so, Dr. White, I'd like you to speak to that first.
Okay.
The strategy of the economy, or the strategy of framing your civil rights activism in an economic framework.
Okay, I think Dr. King was clear that and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but Dr. King was an economic Marxist, I believe, in wholeheartedly. Matter of fact, one of his mentors, while he was in school at Boston, said, it was his dad's friend, said that I believe that Martin is an economic Marxist. He didn't accept Marxism and communism wholeheartedly for a number of reasons. But he's an economic Marxist, and he understood the power structure and how the economy and economic factors dictated who survived and who did not survive. So even as early, now the later King is much more radical, but as early as Montgomery, he understood the bus boycott. Not only would it stop blacks from getting on the bus, but it would hurt the bus companies' pocket. And oftentimes it's missed that literally every city he went into, he called for an economic boycott. What made Birmingham successful, one of the things that made Birmingham successful, was not only the children marching and to see this gross and pornographic treatment of children by police officers with dogs and water hoses, but they had the Easter Sunday boycott. And you know that when black folk don't buy clothes for Easter, come on, talk back to me. I mean, I grew up in church. When we got the Easter outfits. And when they didn't buy clothes for that Easter Sunday, it put pressure on those merchants. And the merchants said, we've got to do something about this. And they began hiring more blacks. And so there's no doubt that the economic structure, economic oppression is significant. If you go back to Jared mentioning Two Americas, also the other America, he gave that speech multiple times after the Watts riots in '65. But he made it clear that there are two Americas: one where people live in luxury, and the other where people live on the lonely island of poverty. And Coretta Scott King, she calls it the pornography or the evil or the violence, that's the word she uses, the violence of poverty and all the things that poverty creates. And I'll say this, and I know I got to stop, but Doc says that after fighting the civil rights movement and getting voting rights and the right to ride on the bus and breaking interstate, having integration on interstate travel, he says it's a crime for a man to be able to go to a counter to get a hamburger, but don't have the money to buy a hamburger. And so civil rights didn't cost America anything, but economic rights, economic justice is where it was going to hurt. And so he transitioned and he began moving towards the Poor People Campaign, which would have been the culmination of his work. But unfortunately, he was assassinated before then, and we never saw the fulfillment in totality of what Dr. King could have brought to America with the Poor People's Campaign.
Thank you for that. Just in a few moments, we'll be back. We want to continue this conversation, talking about Martin Luther King's legacy, and we'll go a little bit deeper into that.
We don't sit and wait till somebody wait their turn. We cut you off and we talk over. That's what the barbershop is about.
Winner will be, but the illusion, or what you were alluding to, is the fact that you look like a criminal.
He don't even vote, so his vote don't even count.
If you really want to do something, get black people together, and we're going to start having an agenda. We're going to write down 10 things that we want for our people.
You know, in the climate that we're in right now, the hope is gone, and it's a lot of unrest, and just, man, how can people come back together and just unite?
WRCX TV 40, and we're continuing this conversation about Martin Luther King and his legacy. And so, Jared, I have a question for you, and I'd love for us to talk a little bit about Martin Luther King in a different way. So we talked about how we learned about Martin Luther King as a pacifist, a nonviolent activist, an intelligent individual with an intellect and things as such. Tell me a little bit more about why you believe that Martin Luther King was framed in that way.
It's a more convenient narrative. And so Martin Luther King Day, it's Martin Luther King Day, and we're going to see a lot of pacifying of black voices. People are going to say, what would Martin Luther King think of that, right? They're going to say he would never approve of this kind of rhetoric or this kind of violence, et cetera, right? And one thing people misunderstand about Martin Luther King is he just didn't think that violence and destruction of property was a good strategy. Not that it was morally abhorrent, right? He understood that people were angry and the riot was the voice of the voiceless. He understood that. And so he would have never tried to pacify people in a way that people use his legacy to pacify us, right? And what people need to understand is Martin Luther King was a lot more radical, as Dr. White alluded to earlier, than we give him credit for, and his analysis went a lot deeper than that. They frame him as if he was only worried about respectability politics, right? Put on a suit, look well, talk right, talk proper, don't do anything to shake up too many feathers, right? The people around him were saying, yo, look well, talk proper, don't shake too many feathers, but as Dr. White said, he was steadfast in his message and what he believed in. And I think it's unfair to his legacy what they try to do with regard to pacifying activists and the Black Lives Matter movement, using some of his cherry-picked words that he used to kind of shut us up.
Absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think what you're speaking to is just the inability for leaders, specifically black leaders, if we look at the historical context, being more complex than this individual principle that will be palatable or will be able to be marketable, mass-produced, and things as such. So Dr. White, talk to us a little bit about this specific message. Martin Luther King as a non-violent activist. Tell me a little bit about why was it important to frame him in that way? And then talk to me a little bit about a critical analysis of that. Has that been beneficial for us? Did we grow from that? Did we learn from that? Please tell me.
Okay, I think that framing him, the use of the nomenclature of framing Dr. King as a nonviolent activist is not necessarily a fair assessment, because that's who he was. He makes it clear that Gandhi furnished the method, but Jesus furnished the message. That King was wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence, not necessarily a pacifist, but he was committed to nonviolence as a tool to dismantle white supremacy. For a number of reasons, he was committed to nonviolence. Number one, because of his Christian worldview. He clearly understood the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus says, love your enemies. And he was convinced, after reading about Gandhi and reading about the Salt March of Gandhi and how Gandhi overthrew the British government, he was wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence as a way of fighting racism, Jim Crowism in America. He was committed to that. And I think that we do damage when we extrapolate King from the 1960s in the heart of the American Civil Rights Movement and put him in the 2000s or 2020s without understanding contextually what was going on. There was no way in the world that we could have sustained a violent guerrilla warfare fight against white supremacy. We didn't have enough guns. We didn't have enough. There were not enough people committed to dying for the cause of civil rights. And so King, when the riots of '65 happened, Stokely Carmichael gets on the platform in Greenwood, Mississippi, argues Black Power, the Black Power movement starts. King has a fit. He says, y'all about to mess this up because we cannot do that. But then finally, King understood that violence besmirches or mars the character of the perpetrator of the violence, as well as the person who what violence was perpetrated against. King believes in this ideology of personalism. And personalism argues that every human being is made in the image of God. And when I perpetrate violence against Jared or against you, I am marring the very image of God in you. And so you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, even if you don't treat me with dignity and respect. Simply because you're created in the image of God. I got one last point, I'm stopping. And he argues, okay, once we get over Jim Crowism and racism, our desire is to build a beloved community. It's not to build a black nation that oppresses white people. So if I make you my enemy and I overpower you with violence, now once I get in power, I have to use that same power that you used on me to keep you oppressed. But if I love the hell out of you and make you a friend and use love as the weapon, now we can walk together and build community. And so I think that King was, again, wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence because of his Christian ethic and because he was clear that that's the only way to build beloved community.
Got it. So there are two things that immediately come to my mind, and I want to go to you, Jared, just to reiterate. So one of the things that you said that I think is really important is that Martin Luther King chose nonviolence because he believed that violence would impact the individual who participated in it, even if it was for the sake, for a grander cause, right? So it was the